Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Well, it's an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be here. Part of the pleasure and the privilege is that I've got to know most of the team here over a few years. We've had the opportunity to do ministry together on university campuses, and they are amazing evangelists and apologists in the UK. I can't imagine what it's like here in the various German-speaking countries. Also hugely excited about the digital work that you guys are doing. In 4 weeks, I met 4 people who've come to faith solely through going online onto the internet, not through any people at all. So that's an incredible work, and I'm so excited to see the way that you're investing in that so intelligently. So I've been tasked with the job of inspiring you and encouraging you in the settings that God has called you to be or where you presently are. So at the end of this talk, if you don't feel encouraged and inspired, ask for your money back, really, because that's my job here for this talk. And I'd love to start with a story that was told by a Professor John Lennox, who many of you know, a professor at Oxford University. Shared a story around the lunch table. He was chatting to a guy at one of the events he was speaking at, who was an electrician in his 20s. And it turned out that this man, who was young man who was an electrician, that John met just a few weeks into his first job doing electrical wiring in new houses. This young man was summoned to see his boss, who angrily accused him of laziness because he was slower than his workmates when it came to installing wiring into the houses. The young man replied to his boss and said, "I can't work any faster because the wiring under the floors has to be done." Oh, didn't see that, sorry. The wiring under the floors has to be done carefully to fulfill the regulations regarding fire hazards. The boss angrily retorted by saying, "Who sees under the floorboards?" "My Lord does," the young man answered without hesitation. He was fired on the spot, but happily, he found a new and satisfying job soon afterwards. There is a widespread conviction that God and the marketplace don't mix, that the competitive and cutthroat demands of the workplace are seen as the obvious enemy of Christian values of compassion and love. But the God whom we worship at church is also the God of the marketplace and the workplace. As Abraham Kuyper famously said, there is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, "Mine." Yet most churchgoers cannot remember the last time their pastor preached on the topic of work. On Sundays at church, we may pray for our church leaders or for leaders of society, but how often do we pray for Sam, the baker, or Sally, the banker, sitting in the third row? And yet consider this, if one went to church every Sunday for 40 years, they would log about 2,000 hours in the pew. By contrast, during those 40 years, they would log about 100,000 hours at work. If God is interested in every aspect of our lives, then surely He's interested in the workplace. As John Stott often declared, Jesus Christ is either Lord of all or He is not Lord at all. In a famous lecture entitled "Why Work?", Dorothy Sayers argued, "In nothing has the church so lost her hold on reality as in her failure to understand and respect the vocation of our work. She has allowed work and religion to become separate departments and is astonished to find that as a result, the greater part of the world's intelligent workers have become irreligious or at least uninterested in religion. But is it astonishing?" she asks. "How can anyone remain interested in a religion which seems to have no concern with 9/10 of his life?" But the good news is God is interested in our work lives. As Mark Green articulates it, work is actually the primary activity God created us to pursue in communion with Him and in partnership with others. And yet for many Christians, work is often seen as a burden or as a means by which we earn money to do the things we actually really like. And so we live for the weekend, the holiday, our long service leave, our retirement. As a result, the working hours of our lives are relegated to irrelevance. But what if there was a way of recapturing the meaning of work as a way of bringing renewed hope and fulfillment? There is. And it lies in recapturing, or I'm going to change that to reimagining, because we are here to imagine, reimagining God's vision for the vocation of work. In the Greek myth of Sisyphus, poor Sisyphus is condemned by the gods to roll a rock up to the top of a mountain, only to have the rock roll back down to the bottom every time he reaches the top, over and over and over again. It's a picture of unending, meaningless labor. Sometimes Christians can have a sort of Sisyphus theology of work, viewing work as a consequence of the fall of humanity, believing that prior to the fall, Adam and Eve lived in paradise, but then they sinned, and part of the punishment was that humanity had to start working. However, if we go back to the beginning, to Genesis, we see that's not the biblical view of work at all. In Genesis chapter 2, which you may be surprised to discover, occurs prior to Genesis chapter 3. And therefore, prior to the fall, we read these words: "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to rest on a lounge chair and drink pina coladas all day long." Is that what it says? No, it says the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it. So we see work is something you and I were actually created for. It didn't come as a curse of the fall. It was there before the fall. Dorothy Sayers again writes, "Work should be looked upon not as a necessary drudgery to be undergone for the purpose of making money, but as a way of life in which the nature of man should find its proper exercise and delight, and so fulfill itself to the glory of God." Work was God's idea. God himself is a worker. In other creation stories of the cultures surrounding Israel at the time, such as the Babylonian creation myth, humans were created. Do you want to know why? To do the work that was considered beneath the gods to do. Yet in the book of Genesis, you see God literally digging his hands into the dirt. In Genesis 2, verse 7, in the Babylonian creation myths, the image of God only applies to kings, to royalty. In the book of Genesis, God himself is a worker, and all human beings are created in the image of God, giving both work and human beings a dignity and a status not found in other worldviews. All work done well, whether we are paid for it or whether we are not paid for it, all work done well has dignity in the eyes of God. And one of the key ways in which we are to image or represent God on earth is by carrying out what theologians sometimes call the creation mandate in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, to be fruitful and multiply and gently subdue and have dominion over the earth. Now, this is not, as is sometimes thought, about conquering, it's about cultivating. The words subdue and have dominion get lost in translation, but what it means is that we are to contribute as sub-creators to God's creative project on earth, to care and to craft and to cultivate God's world on his behalf and in relationship with him. And this means that when we as human beings go to work, whether we are making clothes or making chocolate, or building machines or writing software, or practicing law or tilling fields, or mending broken bodies, or nurturing children, or looking after aging parents, we are answering God's call to steward and cultivate his world as his representatives, his image. This painting by Thomas Hart Benton, entitled "Cradling Wheat," captures something of the dignity and the significance of work, reminding us that it's in the ordinary rhythms of life and work that we are fulfilled. As moment by moment we fulfill the call to cultivate goodness, to grow goodness, to nurture goodness and blessing on a little patch of God's magnificent creation for his glory and for the blessing of the world. And do you know what else the Bible says? Our work won't finish when we die. The afterlife isn't going to be us just sitting around looking at each other and looking at God and doing nothing. There will be meaningful and fulfilling work to do. In Revelation 2, verse 26, Jesus says, "The one who conquers and who keeps my works until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations." As Christians, we are destined to reign with Jesus Christ in the endlessly ongoing creative work and governance of the universe. Talk about a job upgrade. In the parable of the talents, Jesus explains that it's our faithfulness in the few things in this present phase of life that develops the kind of character that can be entrusted with the many things in the phase of life to come. What these many things will exactly look like, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has yet conceived. But perhaps the poet George MacDonald catches something of a glimpse of it when he writes, "And in the perfect time, O perfect God, when we are in our home, our natal home, when joy shall carry every sacred load, and from its life and peace no heart shall roam. What if thou make us able to make like thee, to light with moons, to clothe with greenery, to hang gold sunsets over a rose and purple sea, and maybe to build beautiful alpine mountains." Who knows? So you see, our work as human beings, it's hugely significant and meaningful. Our work matters to God because God too is a worker. And when we work, we reflect our Creator. So that's the first point. Point number one, our work matters to God. And the second point, equally important, God matters to our work. Our work matters to God, and God matters to our work. But here's the question. You may be wondering, if work is such a gift, why does it often feel like such a curse? Why do we so often feel frustrated in our jobs or unfulfilled in our careers? What's going on? Well, this comes back to something that we touched on earlier. The Bible says that when humanity sinned, when they stopped trusting and listening to God, that pain and suffering entered into the world. And so we read in Genesis chapter 3, after humanity sinned, that cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat from it all the days of your life. And so our experience of work now involves pain as well as pleasure, futility as well as fulfillment. In a fallen world, we must contend with frustrations at work, the struggle to get things done, the challenge of difficult colleagues. I don't know if you have any of those. Of stressful situations, of plans not working out as we hoped. Until Christ comes again, our work will never be perfect, but it can still be filled with purpose, for it is still intrinsically meaningful and valuable. As Dallas Willard puts it, work is not the curse of humanity's fall into sin. It's sweat from self-reliance that is a curse. Os Guinness is a well-known Christian writer who in his book, The Call, talks about the importance, therefore, of learning to live our lives before one audience that trumps all others, the audience of one. He writes, "I live before the audience of one. Before all others, I have nothing to prove, nothing to gain, nothing to lose." As Paul writes in Colossians chapter 3, "In whatever we do, we are to work at it with all our heart as working for the Lord rather than for people." This principle of living for the audience of one, the audience of God, in our workplace can bring renewed joy, purpose, and hope into our work lives in multiple ways. For example, one of the biggest problems in the workplace today is anxiety. And often at the root of that anxiety is the search for significance and success that hinges on the recognition or approval of others. Most of us, whether we recognize it or are aware of it or not, operate in our work or in our careers with an eye to the approval of some audience or other. And so we end up anxiously concerning ourselves with the outward symbols of perceived success, worrying about whether we measure up or not, whether we are a success or not, whether we are significant in the eyes of others or not. But living for the audience of one can rescue us from trying to find our significance and our identity in whether other people think we are a success. And this can be particularly freeing if we work for overly demanding or unreasonable bosses or colleagues, to know that ultimately we're not working to please their impossible expectations, but rather to please the Lord. Also, if on the other hand we work in an environment where people are prone to laziness, only working hard when the boss is looking, our faith also directs us to be different, to work wholeheartedly, as it says in Ephesians chapter 6, whether our earthly masters are noticing or not, as if we were serving the Lord, not people, because we know that it is the Lord who rewards us ultimately. And thus, by living for the audience of one, we're more likely to avoid the equal and opposite extremes of irresponsibility and laziness on the one hand, and anxiety and burnout on the other. By living for the audience of one, our place of work can become for us a place of worship. Plus, in learning to live for the audience of one, we discover that we don't have to try to get the jobs or the roles that only this world values, usually those that command more money or power. Rather, we can begin to think of our careers much more so in terms of service or vocation, aligning what we do with a sense of purpose in who God made us to be and the gifts that He's given us. The author Frederick Buechner helpfully defines our vocation like this: the place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. To the greatest extent possible, Christians should seek to work in that place where one's gifts and passions intersect with God's priorities and the world's needs. Christian author Amy Sherman calls this our vocational sweet spot. Finding that sweet spot, she says, is a journey. It takes time, and we might not get there straight away. We might not get there perfectly. And of course, there are certain seasons of life where that's more challenging than others. But nonetheless, she says, to the extent that it is possible, this is the goal to which we ought to aim in our work lives, rather than some arbitrary goal fashioned on what we think will make us look most successful in the world's eyes. And yet, even as we seek to follow our vocation or calling, we must also remember the fundamental principle that even prior to being called to do something, we are called to someone. Our primary calling is always to God. Our secondary callings are the things that we do in our lives for God, and they can vary in different seasons of life. As Os Guinness writes, we can therefore say, as a matter of secondary calling, that we are called to make homemaking or the practice of law or to art history. But these are callings rather than the calling. They are our personal answer to God's address, our response to God's summons. Secondary callings matter, but only because the primary calling, following Christ, matters most. But sometimes people struggle to see their jobs through the lens of a vocation or calling, especially, I've discovered, in the business world. For example, Dallas Willard observes that if you were to ask people today, what is the business of business? The spontaneous response among most people in business today is that the business of business is money. The business of business is to make money for those who are engaged in it. He says the answer seems so obvious to anyone in business that hardly anybody would question it. But actually, the idea that the primary purpose of business is to make money for those who are engaged in it is a quite recent view of history, historically speaking. The older tradition of the business profession is that, like other professions, the business profession has an important moral role to play in society. John Ruskin, for example, living in the 19th century, wrote that of the 5 great intellectual professions necessary to the life of every civilized nation was as follows. With respect to that nation, the soldier's profession is to defend it, the pastor's to teach it, the physician's to keep it in health, the lawyer's to enforce justice in it, the merchants, the business persons, to provide for it. Thus, the essential function of every profession in their own way is to bless, to give something to the community rather than to pluck or to plunder from the community. As Ruskin observes, it is no more the business person's function to get profit for himself than it is a pastor's function to get his stipend. The stipend is a due and necessary adjunct, but not the object of his life if he be a true clergyman, any more than the fee is the object of a true physician. Neither is his fee the object of life to a true merchant. All three, if true men, have a work to be done. Do you see what he's saying? The primary aim of the business owner or business person is not to make money any more than the primary aim of the doctor is to make money, or the teacher, or the pastor. And deep down, we all know this, which is why no business in the world has as its public mission statement, we exist to make money. And why no professionals tell their clients that the main reason they are in their profession is for the money. Of course, one must get paid if one is to serve. But the challenge is, we live in a world where you can make money without really helping anyone. For example, you can buy a house and paint over the cracks and then sell it on before anyone finds out. Or you can buy a business and then fire half the staff and then sell it on before the inevitable problems of not having enough staffing begin to show themselves. Or you can sell products to people that they don't really need. Or you can make terrific services and products for your customers and yet treat your employees with terrible working conditions. John Ruskin writes, "It is the responsibility of businesses not only to be thinking about how to make money, but how to make what we do most beneficial to people's lives." Now, this is a high calling, not just for business owners, but for all of us who have responsibility and influence in our places of work. All of us who have the privilege of having an influence in our places of work should be asking ourselves this question: how can what we do as an organization be done in such a way that it brings good into the world? How can what we do as an organization be done in such a way that it brings good into the world? And encouragingly, there are lots of great examples of people whose faith has inspired them to make a difference in their work. The former CEO of Hallmark Cards, Irv Hockaday, one day asked himself how his faith might shape decisions about the product offerings at Hallmark Cards. And as he prayed about it, he decided that Hallmark would make greeting cards for people who had loved ones who were dying. He says, these were for people who were in the hospice. We realized there was no profit to be made on this. We couldn't sell enough of these cards to make a profit, but we felt like it was the right thing to do to help people to be able to care for their loved ones during times like this. Arthur Guinness, another great example, grew up in the 18th century at a time when gin houses were springing up all throughout Ireland and England to the point that every sixth house in England was a gin house. And there was an epidemic, as you can imagine, of drunkenness and poverty and crime. And moved by the plight of broken homes and broken families, Arthur prayed to God for inspiration and help to do something about the rampant alcoholism on the streets of Ireland. In fact, he felt God called him to make a, quote, drink that men will drink that will be good for them. And so he ended up developing a dark, stout beer called Guinness that contained so much iron that people felt full before they could drink more pints, and so they wouldn't get drunk. Hence, Guinness Brewery was born. Similarly, have you ever heard of Cadbury chocolate? If you've tasted Swiss chocolate, you probably don't want to try Cadbury's chocolate. It just doesn't compare. All right, nothing compares. But it's a chocolate that was It's very popular in England and other parts of the world. But Cadbury chocolate was founded by a Quaker, John Cadbury. He was also concerned with the damaging effects of alcoholism on families and societies. So he started selling drinking chocolate as an alternative beverage to alcohol. And his sons, when they took over the new successful business, because it did very well, also influenced by their Christian faith, tried to think of other ways. They asked God for imagination and inspiration, ways of improving people's lives. And at a time in England when factory conditions were so terrible and dangerous, the Cadburys made sure their factories were safe and humane. They provided their employees with good wages, medical treatment, and pension plans, and they bought up land around the factory to build a community for their workers named Bourneville Village. They wanted to provide a safe, pleasant place for people to live rather than the crowded housing where disease and crime and poverty was so rife. And George Cadbury said of his plans, if each man could have his own house, a large garden to cultivate and healthy surroundings, then I thought there will be for them a better opportunity of a happy family life. And the brothers ended up setting new standards for working conditions and living conditions in Victorian Britain. And the Cadbury plant in Bourneville became known as the factory in a garden. It had a redeeming, purifying, transforming effect on society and set a different vision of what working life ought to look like. Now, these are just a few examples of the many examples of the church opening themselves up to God at work. Not just on Sundays, but in all their lives, including their Mondays to Fridays. Followers of Jesus being salt and light in the world with God's help, praying for and taking responsibility for influencing the institutions and workplaces in which they work for the common good. As James Hunter argues in his book, To Change the World, the church as it exists within the wide range of individual vocations in every sphere of social life, commerce, philanthropy, education, etc., must be present in the world that in ways that work towards the constructive subversion of all frameworks of social life that are incompatible with the shalom for which we were made and to which we are called. As a natural expression of its passion to honor God in all things and to love our neighbor as ourselves, the church and its people will challenge all structures that dishonor God, dehumanize people, and neglect or do harm to the creation. Of course, another way in which we can be salt and light in the workplace is by building relationships with people at work and sharing our faith with others. The fact that we are working alongside our colleagues week by week gives us an opportunity that others do not have, which God expects us to use for his purposes. Now, just to clarify, that doesn't mean sending an email to our colleagues every morning with a Bible verse for the day, or leaving gospel tracts on everyone's desk each week. That probably would be a little bit counterproductive. Your witness in the workplace begins first of all by the way that you work. The words that we say matter, but don't forget our life preaches all week. What message are we preaching in our workplaces by the way we live? What message are we preaching with how we deal with difficult clients or co-workers, or how we deal with failure, or in the interest that we show in our colleagues' lives, or in our willingness to put ourselves out for others? Are we living in such a way that it generates intrigue in others and stirs up questions about the reason for the hope that we have? Another way to generate intrigue and questions in those around us about the reason for the hope that we have is by being genuinely interested in the lives of our work colleagues. William Wilberforce was the famous slavery abolitionist, but he was also a natural evangelist in the workplace, which was in the world of politics. And the reason he was a natural evangelist was not because he talked about Jesus at people, but because he talked about Jesus with people. And the reason he was good about talking about Jesus with people is because he was genuinely interested in other people and in getting to know their story. For example, a lady of high society once had dinner with William Wilberforce's best friend, the Prime Minister. Nice to have friends in high places. And after having had dinner with the Prime Minister, this lady of high society was interviewed by a journalist and asked, what was it like having had dinner with the Prime Minister? To which she replied, after having had dinner with the Prime Minister, I am convinced he is the most interesting person in the world. Well, the next week, she had dinner with William Wilberforce. And the same journalist interviewed her and said, what was it like having had dinner with William Wilberforce? To which she replied, after having had dinner with William Wilberforce, I am convinced that I am the most interesting person in the world. That's the sort of person Wilberforce was. People found him interesting because he was interested. And because he was genuinely interested in people. People liked him and opened up to him and respected what he had to say when he did speak about his life and his faith in Jesus. So let us not be afraid to talk about our faith with others, because remember, God is at work. Usually the best way to create opportunities to share the gospel is just like William Wilberforce, simply by being interested in your colleagues, by asking them questions about themselves and about their lives and about the things that they are interested in outside of work. Because when you do that, most people will appreciate that you are interested and that you are friendly, and will also naturally begin to ask you questions about your life and about the things that you're interested in outside of work. And when they do that, what have they given you? An opportunity. A very natural opportunity for you to share deeper about your life and beliefs, such as the fact that you go to church on the weekend, you pray, you have a faith, you're a Christian. And when you do that, are you forcing your faith on anyone? Are you Bible bashing them? No, you are simply honestly answering the questions that they are asking you in conversation, sharing back and forth about the things that matter to you both. This is not rocket science, but it is relational. Talking about yourself and about your faith with people rather than at people. So in closing, can I invite you all to consider, are you living for the audience of one in your work context? Do you really believe that your work matters to God and that God matters to your work? Because the more that we press into this, the more we learn to live for the audience of one in our workplace, the more we will begin to experience the meaning and fulfillment and hope that comes from working ultimately for God. And not just for God, but with God. Co-creating with the Creator and cultivating goodness in the world, not just for this life, but for all eternity. For as Leslie Newbigin puts it, every faithful active service, every honest labor to make the world a better place, which seems to have been forever lost and forgotten in the rubble of history, will be seen on that day at the final resurrection to have contributed to the perfect fellowship of God's kingdom. All who committed their work in faithfulness to God will be by him raised up to share in the new age, and will find that their labor was not lost, but that it has found its place in the completed kingdom. As we can say together with the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Jesus Christ. Therefore, let us be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. In the Lord your labor is not in vain. Thank you for your time.